Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to discuss about David Hume's arguments against miracles, and we are going to also see the critical analysis of his arguments against miracles, and we will see some of the philosophical response to Hume's arguments. So let's just begin this episode by talking about a little bit of an introduction who David Hume was. David Hume was one of the most important figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was an empiricist. So, empiricist is the person who only believes on a sense experiences. They believe all knowledge comes primarily from the sense experiences. So, they are called empiricists. So, Hume is one of the empiricists and a major influence on modern skepticism. He wrote in section X of An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. I would recommend to read Hume's book, An Enquiry Concerning the Human Understanding. And in that section X, or the section 10 of his book on Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he wrote the arguments against miracles. So Hume is most influential critique of supernatural claims in the history of philosophy. Hume argues that human testimony can never testify belief in a miracle because such events by definition contradict the uniform experience of natural law. The enduring importance of Hume's argument lies in the epistemological focus, particularly its appeal to testimony, probability, and evidential standards rather than to the metaphysical possibility of divine action. So I would highly recommend you to read if you want to master the arguments that Hume gives. You have to read section X of his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where he talks about miracles. So in this episode, we are going to focus on his arguments on miracles, and then we are going to see some of the philosophical responses of Hume's arguments and how we can refute the Hume's arguments. So Hume gives the definition of miracles that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. He emphasizes that natural laws are established by firm and unalterable experience. They are grounded in the uniform experience, and later in this episode we are going to see what does he means by uniform experiences. Therefore, he would say that proof against miracle is as strong as any argument from the experience can be, and therefore he would say that miracles are impossible. So let's look at what is the philosophical importance of this issue. So miracles are, as we know, they are central to the theistic and the Christian truth claims. For example, resurrection of Jesus. That is the greatest miracle. There is no Christianity without resurrection of Jesus. So the epistemology of testimony. Epistemology means the study of how we know things. Many miracle claims come to us through testimony, what people say they saw or they experience. The question is, can we reasonably trust the eyewitness reports about rare and one-time events? So the limits of empiricism is that it exposes whether empiricism evaluates evidence or rules out events a priori. So empiricism says that knowledge comes from sense experience and observation. The question here is that does empiricism carefully examine miracle evidence, or does it reject the miracle before even looking at the evidence? If someone says miracles cannot happen because nature always works the same way, they may be ruling them out in advance, which is called a priori. A priori is before examining the evidences for that event, they would just rule out that miracles are not possible instead of evaluating the actual case. So that is the limits of empiricism. Hume's challenge about law of nature is that Hume argues that the laws of nature are based on the repeatable experience. Since we repeatedly observe natural events, for example, the law of gravity. So when we throw the things from the top, it is going to go down because of the law of gravity. So that is a repeatable experience that we can experience every day of our life. So he would argue that the laws of nature are based on the repeatable experience. Since we repeatedly observe natural events, we should trust those patterns rather than rare miracle reports. But this raises a problem. Can we use past experience to say that exceptions are impossible? Can we use our past experience to say that there can be no exceptions? Or would that be circular reasoning, assuming miracles never happen because we believe miracles never happen? Is it just based on the belief? In simple terms, if we say that, is it fair to reject miracle claims just because it doesn't fit our usual experience? And that's what Hume would argue in his arguments, that because we do not see resurrection happening all the time, and therefore we should not believe that miracle happened or the resurrection happened. So that is the core of Hume's arguments against miracle. So let's just look at his argument, and this is called the hard form of his argument. A miracle, by definition, violates the laws of nature. The laws of nature have been established by firm and unalterable experience. Therefore, Hume would say that the proof against a miracle from very nature of the fact is an entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So Hume says that miracle is something that breaks the normal laws of nature. But the laws of nature are based on our constant and repeated experience, as we have seen. How the world works. Since we have always observed nature behaving in consistent ways, that repeated experiences count as very strong evidence. So if someone claims a miracle happened, Hume argues that all of our past experience counts as powerful evidence against it. In his view, the evidence against a miracle will always be stronger than the evidence for it, and therefore he would reject the miracle. Now, let's look at the soft form of Hume's argument. A miracle, by definition, is rare occurrence, whereas natural law is, by definition, a description of regular occurrence. For example, the law of gravity, which is a regular occurrence, and miracle, by definition, is a rare occurrence. They don't happen all the time. So the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. And that's where the problem is in Hume's argument, that the evidence for regular is always greater than that for the rare. Therefore, Hume would say that wise individuals always base their belief on the greater evidence. Therefore, wise individuals should never believe in the miracle. So Hume says that miracle is something very rare, while natural laws describe things that happen regularly. Because regular events happen over and over again, we have much more evidence for them than for rare events. Wise people, he says, that should never believe on miracles. They should believe on a strongest evidence. So since regular events always have more supporting evidence than rare events, Hume concludes that wise people should never believe in miracles. So that's his soft form of his argument. What is Hume's central epistemic principle? So he would say that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. A belief determined by comparative probability. When a testimony of a miracle conflicts with the uniform experience of nature, the rational choice is to prefer the latter. That means you should not believe in a miracle. Uniform experiences outweighs testimonial evidence. So in other words, according to Hume, whenever someone testifies about any miracle, one always needs to weigh that against previous experience. So just because I've not seen someone raised from the dead, that means that I should not believe that. So I should always believe on things that I see in my habits, and only those regular events I should believe, and all the rare events, before even looking into the evidence for that event, I should just discard those testimonies or those miracles. So one always needs to weigh that against previous experience, observation, and experiments. If one finds a greater number of prior experiences against the testimony of miracle, then Hume would say that the probability of happening of that miracle is doubtful, and therefore you should not believe on miracles. So that is Hume's central epistemic principle behind his arguments against miracle. Now, what is his objection? So Hume would say, based on the testimony and credibility, that no miracle attested by a sufficient number of competent witnesses. Hume argues that history offers no example of miracle supported by the sufficient number of credible, educated, and disinterested witnesses. He writes that there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by the sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves. So that's what he writes in his Enquiry when he talks about miracles. So he would say that testimony is subject to error, deception, and biases. Extraordinary claims, he would say, demands extraordinary evidence. We see this slogan more often, but that is not true. Statement is self-contradictory. When you say extraordinary, I would say that, first of all, what do you mean by extraordinary? Secondly, I would say that if miracle demands an extraordinary evidence, does it mean that in order to prove the miracle, you need another miracle? And that is going to be an infinite regress of miracle, because in order for you to prove one miracle, you have to have another miracle. In short, all you need to prove the miracle has happened is a reasonable and sufficient evidence and not an extraordinary evidence. Whenever someone says an extraordinary claims demands extraordinary evidence, you have to ask them that, what do you mean by extraordinary? And it is a self-defeating statement. Now, what is objection to? Psychological and cultural factors. According to Hume, human beings have stronger propensity to believe the extraordinary and marvelous. So when someone says, and when someone talks to you about miracle, according to the human psychology, we have strong propensity to believe the extraordinary and marvelous, according to Hume. Rather than producing skepticism, the very miraculous character of such claims often intensifies religious enthusiasm. He contends that the religionist, even when aware that a miracle report lacks factual reality, may nonetheless persist in affirming it out of desire to advance what he regards as a holy cause. Hume regards this response as fundamentally irrational, arguing that the greater the degree to which a claim violates established laws of nature or common experience, the less credible it ought to be judged. In other words, Hume believed that miracles are most frequently reported among the uneducated and primitive cultures. So, miracle reports flourish in pre-scientific culture. Testimony undermined by the sociological conditions. Hume believed that most frequently reported miracles are among the uneducated and primitive cultures. According to this argument, even if civilized people give admission to any of these miracle claims, they would have heard these stories from their ignorant and barbarous ancestors. These are merely received opinions, and this miracle story spread more easily when sown in proper soil, according to Hume. So he would say that miracles are more popular among uneducated, uncivilized people. You will more commonly see these miracle stories in villages as compared to urban cities. So that's his psychological and cultural factors that he gives for believing in miracles, that the people who believe in miracles, they belong to such group. Let's look at his third objection, that is competing religious miracles. So according to Hume's argument, miracle claims reported in different religions that support contradictory doctrines, their testimonies cancel each other out. For example, if Islam claims the miracle that proves that doctrine true, and Hinduism claims another miracle that proves their doctrine true, according to Hume, both their doctrines cannot be true at the same time. They contradict each other. If each religion has miracle stories that point in different directions, then their miracle claims cancel each other out. So conflicting testimonies cancel evidential force. No miracle can function as decisive religious proof. So therefore, he would discard any miracle claims given by different religion, and he would say that different religion reports are incompatible miracles and they cancel each other out. Now, let's go to the responses to Hume's arguments. So, when we examine Hume's arguments, we can see that there is a circularity in his arguments, and his arguments are question begging. When he says uniform experience presuppose miracle never occur. If Hume presupposes to know the experience is uniform in advance of evidence, then it begs the question. Dr. Norman Geisler, when responding to the hard form of Hume's argument in his book 12 Points That Show Christianity is True, he would say that if all miracles are violation of what cannot be altered, then miracles are by that very fact impossible. Alternatively, if Hume intends by uniform experience only the limited experiences of those who have not encountered a miracle, then the appeal is question begging, since it excludes contrary testimony by definition. C.S. Lewis, he has written on Hume and miracle, and he says that now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words they have never happened, why then they have never happened? Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles had never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in circles. So even C.S. Lewis, one of the famous philosophers, he's saying that Hume's arguments is argumenting in circle. His arguments assumes its own conclusion. So Hume's soft form of argument against credibility of miracle has false premise, as we have seen, that says that the evidence for the regular is always greater than that of the rare. At first, his argument may sound correct. For example, a person who is witnessing a car accident from one angle, and if we see the same accident videotaped in slow motion from every angles, as we as an audience have greater evidence for seeing the accident over and over again. That means it's regular. Then does the person who was an eyewitness to the accident who only saw it once, so that's rare. This may be true for a videotape accident, but not in every event of life. This argument can be refuted by using Hume's own naturalistic worldview. There are many examples where naturalists believe that evidence is greater for a singular event than for the regular event, and that is what we are going to see in our next response. So, singular events and historical reasoning. So, rare does not entail epistemically unjustified. History routinely affirms unique, non-repeatable events. For example, the origin of universe. Now, the origin of the universe, according to many cosmologists and even atheists, that happened only one time in the history. Most of the cosmologists believe that universe begin to exist at one point of time, and they give the Big Bang theory to explain the origin of the universe. If we apply Hume's criteria, then this event or the Big Bang should never have happened, as according to Hume, a wise person should never believe this happened, as it has never been repeated over and over again. So just because origin of the universe has never happened again in the history, and therefore according to Hume, we should not believe in the origin of the universe, which is a one-time event. Similarly, the origin of life, that is also a one-time event. Most of the scientists, they maintain that life arose from non-living matter at some point in the distant past. Even though no such transition has ever been observed to occur under present condition, scientists believe that life originated from non-living matter at some point of time in the distant past. But according to Hume, you should not even believe in that because it's not repeated. It doesn't happen again and again. It's a singular event. Similarly, macroevolution is another example of singular historical process, which is widely affirmed by atheist and naturalistic framework. According to this view, all living organisms ultimately descended from the common ancestor through natural process operating over vast period of time. without supernatural intervention. So macroevolution has never been repeated in nature or in the laboratory. But still, many evolutionists believe this to be the fact. According to Hume, you should not believe on macroevolution because it only happened one time. Now, Hume's own birth, that happened only one time in the history, and therefore he should not even believe on his own birth, but he would believe that, which is a singular event that is rare, that happened only one time in the history. So many historical events, like for example, the history of Napoleon Bonaparte, there are many rare events that happened in the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. But according to Hume, you should not believe that because that is a rare, unusual, singular events. And if we go by Hume's reasoning, we have to discard many of the historical events because that happened only one time in the history. So Hume's standard undermines the historiography itself. Now, the another response we can give is probability versus evidence. Hume conflates low prior probability with disbelief. If we see many medical discoveries, no one experienced it previously. For example, before antibiotics existed, no one had seen a bacterial infection cured by penicillin. Before organ transplants, no one had ever seen a human survive with someone else's heart or kidney. Before vaccines, no one had ever seen immunity produced by small dose of weakened virus. So all these medical discoveries which no one has experienced before. So Hume conflicts low prior probability with disbelief. He would say that just because there are low prior probabilities, you should discard the miracle claims. So Hume arguments against miracle confuse evidence and probability. For example, all the people who lived before Jesus died and did not rise from the dead. But there is evidence that Jesus died and rose from the dead. It will be irrelevant to compare past natural events with the current supernatural event, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Hume tries to add evidence from all previous events rather than weighing the evidence for the event in question. A person who wins $1 million lottery once, we don't hold his money and tell the person that you have to win that 4 more times in a row. So here the evidence for rare is greater than for the regular. We need to have good evidence for that event, and it doesn't matter whether it was regular or rare. All we need is good, sufficient evidence. William Lane Craig, one of the famous philosopher, an analytic philosopher, he gives a law court analogy during his video when he was asked about responding to Hume's arguments. He gave a simple law court analogy to simplify the concept of probability updating with evidence, which aligns with Bayes' theorem. He explains this by giving an example of court case where husband is accused of murdering his wife. Before considering any evidence, one might estimate the probability that he is the murderer based purely on general knowledge. This is the prior probability. This initial probability might be low because murders by husbands are not that common. This is similar to how Hume assumes how unlikely a miracle is in general. But once evidence is presented, such as DNA, fingerprint, motive, lack of alibi, and eyewitness testimony, the probability is recalculated. The likelihood of observing this evidence if the husband is guilty is compared against the likelihood of observing it if he is innocent. This process is akin to applying Bayes' theorem, where the prior probability is updated with the new data to yield a posterior probability. Hume in this case ignores how well the evidence fits the miracle hypothesis versus alternative explanations. Hume argues that the probability of a miracle, example someone raising from the dead, is extremely low when considered against the backdrop of natural laws. This corresponds to the prior probability. However, Hume only considers this prior probability and ignores the probability of evidence given to miracle. Proper reasoning requires considering both the prior probability and how the evidence affects the likelihood of hypothesis. Dr. Craig law court analogy serves to clarify that evaluating a hypothesis such as a miracle depends both on the initial possibility and how well the evidence supports it. So that's the difference between probability and evidence, which Hume conflicts the low prior probability with disbelief, and therefore he would reject the miracle. But as we can see, that's not the case. You have to always update your prior probabilities based on the evidence that you have. Now, the metaphysical preconditions for miracle. So, miracle presupposes the existence of transcendent God. God, being the creator and the sustainer of the universe, can suspend any natural laws at any time. Dr. Richard Howe, who is a philosopher and professor at Southern Evangelical Seminary, on his essays on miracles, he said that there are two facts that are nested in the definition of miracles. First is the existence of God, as miracle presuppose the existence of God, meaning that miracles as events are not themselves evidence for God's existence. God, being the creator and sustainer of the universe, can suspend any natural law at any time. Secondly, miracles are possible only because God exists and is transcendent to. That means that beyond and other than the creation, God, being transcendent, is not subject to the laws of nature. If God is not fundamentally different from the universe, then any act that he does would be natural, and that could not be considered as miracle. By these two criteria, an atheist who believes there is no God can never interpret an event as miracle. Natural laws as descriptive regularities, not necessities. Miracles are possible if theism is true. By this argument, Hume's philosophy itself is flawed. Instead of principle of uniformity of nature, Hume employed the principle of uniformity of belief. David Hume maintains that human belief formation is fundamentally grounded in custom or habit, a principle that underlies his argument against miracle. For example, our expectation of one event that will follow another. When we hear the phrase knock knock, our response will be, who is there? And another example would be, Old MacDonald had a farm, and then our response is E-I-E-I-O. So when someone says knock knock, we say who is there? According to Hume, as miracles are rare occurrences, no one could ever come to believe in them by habit. If miracles or resurrections were occurring regularly, one could develop a habit of believing them, and they would no longer be called miracles. Instead, they would be regular acts of nature. There is a problem with Hume's thinking, as he would only believe something based on feeling or particular sentiment. But the definition of truth is that truth is something that corresponds to reality. Based on this definition of truth, a proposition is true regardless of how someone feels. This raises a serious issues with Hume's philosophy. And by this, we can conclude that Hume's philosophy itself is flawed. If God exists, miracles are possible. Now, we can see the resurrection as the philosophical case study. For resurrection, we can build a cumulative case. For example, we can say early creedal tradition that talks about resurrection. We have physical evidence of empty tomb. We have post-mortem appearances of risen Christ. We have multiple independent eyewitness testimonies in the Gospels and the rise of the early church in spite of persecution. So this provides a historical core that satisfies the canons of evidence Hume demanded but never applied fairly. The resurrection exemplifies the kind of miracle Hume deemed impossible yet historically defensible. Modern probability theory further reveals that testimony, when reliable and independent, can outweigh prior improbabilities. If any miracle must be refuted decisively, It should be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Instead, Hume uses bait and switch reasoning in his writing in Enquiries concerning human understanding when he talks about miracles, and commits the false equivalence fallacy by citing the pagan healings, second-hand miracle stories, and distant and poorly attested report. So resurrection is categorically different in evidential structure, and treating all miracle claims as evidentially equivalent is historically irresponsible on Hume's part. Although Hume appeals to Catholic and pagan miracle reports as counterexample, he does not show that these accounts are early, multiply attested, independent of one another, or supported by testimony involving substantial cost to the witness. Many disciples died when they testified about the resurrected Christ. They were ready to die for this resurrected Christ. The criteria that are central to evaluating historical credibility. If the resurrection is better attested, then Hume's general skepticism collapses. So we can talk about resurrection as the philosophical case study against Hume's arguments for miracle. Let's just summarize this video. Hume's arguments leads to excessive skepticism. When applied consistently, Hume's evidential standard does not merely exclude miracles, but threatens the rational acceptance of many ordinary historical and natural events that we justifiably believe on testimonial grounds. For example, as we have seen, the origin of life, the origin of universe, Hume's own birth, many historical discoveries, we have to deny that based on Hume's argument. In this respect, Hume's critics proves too strong, undermining not only miracle claims but epistemic foundations of historical knowledge more broadly. Moreover, Hume's arguments fails because it presupposes rather than demonstrate the improbability of miracles. By fixing the prior probability of miraculous event at an arbitrarily low level, the argument becomes circular, effectively assuming the conclusion it seeks to establish. The probability of miracle is inseparable from the prior question of God's existence, as we have seen of Dr. Howe's argument that miracles are possible if a transcendent personal God exists. Then divine intervention in the natural order is not only possible but unsurprising under certain conditions. So if God exists, miracles are possible. Miracle claims must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis using the same historical and evidential criteria applied to the other events in human history. The resurrection of Jesus, as we have seen, stands as a direct counterexample, an event that not only meets historical standards of evidence but also fulfills theologically coherent pattern of divine revelation. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding David Hume's arguments against miracle and the philosophical responses that we can give to defend the claims for miracles that happen in the Bible. We have demonstrated in this video that Hume's arguments are circular, sometimes they are self-defeating, and Hume's philosophy itself is wrong. One of the book that I would recommend is Gary Habermas's book, which is In Defense of Miracles, a comprehensive case for God's action in history, that is written by Douglas Gavitt and Dr. Gary Habermas, who has written extensively on the resurrection of Jesus. He has spent enough time on researching on the resurrection of Jesus, so I would highly recommend this book, In Defense of Miracles. If you want to know more about Hume and his other arguments, I would recommend this book, which is The Cambridge Companion to Hume, which is edited by David Fate Norton. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding the arguments that Hume gives against the miracles and some of the philosophical responses to his arguments. Thank you and God bless.